I want to be upfront that this is the kind of story that sounds like the setup to something much darker than it is. The phrase Uber driver who knew things about me already has a certain flavor to it, a thriller-adjacent flavor, and I want to dispel that before I get into it because that's not what this is. This is not a story about something threatening. This is a story about a strange conversation on an ordinary Tuesday night that I have thought about almost every day since it happened, and that I still cannot explain in any way that fully satisfies me. I was coming back from a work thing, not a fun work thing, a networking event at a downtown hotel, the kind with bad wine and too many people standing in clusters trying to look like they weren't working while clearly working very hard. I'd been there for 2 hours out of a polite minimum of 2 hours, and I left the second the clock allowed, walked out to the sidewalk, and pulled up the app. Tuesday night, around 9, the downtown of a Midwestern city that quiets down early on weeknights. My ride was 4 minutes away. The car that pulled up was a dark sedan, clean. The driver, a man I'd estimate was in his 60s, gray-haired, the kind of face that has been outdoors a lot and carries the evidence of that in a pleasant way. He had a calm quality that some drivers have, and some don't, the ease of someone doing a thing they're good at without needing it to be more than it is. He confirmed my name. I got in. We started moving. We talked a little in the early part of the ride, the way you sometimes do with drivers who are inclined toward conversation and sometimes don't, because they're not. He was inclined mildly, not a talker, exactly, but present and easy and willing to engage if I was. We covered the standard territory. How's your night, you in town for work, that kind of thing. I said I'd been at a work event downtown. He said something about downtown being different than it used to be. We agreed on that in the vague way strangers agree on things about cities. Normal conversation, nothing unusual. We were maybe 10 minutes into the ride moving through the quieter streets between downtown and my neighborhood when he said something that changed the texture of the conversation. He said out of what felt like nowhere, "You've been thinking about your dad." Not asking. Stating. I sat with that for a second. My first instinct was the rational one. He was making a guess, a general comment, something that lands for enough people often enough to seem perceptive. Something about my demeanor, the slightly tired and slightly preoccupied look of a man coming from a networking event he hadn't enjoyed, had led him to a generalized comment about fathers. People think about their fathers. It was a broad enough statement to have decent odds. But here's the thing. I had been thinking about my dad, specifically, concretely, in a way that had been sitting at the back of my mind all evening through the bad wine and the work conversations. My dad had died 14 months before this night, and I was in that specific phase of grief. Not the raw early phase, but the later one, the one where the loss has become integrated enough that it doesn't disable you, but sharp enough that it still catches you unexpectedly, ambushes you in quiet moments with a weight you weren't prepared for. I had been at that networking event making conversation about work projects and thinking in the background, as I had been doing for 14 months, about my dad. I said carefully, "What makes you say that?" He glanced at me in the rearview mirror, briefly, the way drivers check on their passengers. He said, "Something in the way you're sitting. People carry grief differently than other things. It has a particular weight to it." I said, "My dad passed away last year." He nodded. He said, "I'm sorry." Was it sudden? I said, "No, it was a long illness. We had time to prepare," which is the way I had learned to frame it because it was true and because it usually redirected the conversation toward something slightly less sharp. He nodded again, and for a moment we were quiet, and I thought the conversation had moved through and past the thing and was going to settle back into ordinary. Then he said he wanted to be a teacher. I went very still. My dad had wanted to be a teacher. This is not a thing that I discussed at networking events. It is not a thing that came up in casual conversation. It was a piece of my father's history that I knew from my mother, from a conversation we'd had in those long, quiet weeks after he died, when my mother talked about him the way people talk about someone they've spent a life with, when that life has just ended and the accumulation of it is pressing on them, looking for somewhere to go. She had told me that when my dad was young, before circumstance and practicality redirected him toward the work he actually did for 30 years, he had wanted to teach. History, she thought. He'd been good at explaining things, at making connections between ideas, at the specific patience that good teaching requires. It had been a different version of a life that he'd set aside and that I had never heard him mention directly. I said, almost in a whisper, because the inside of a moving car on a Tuesday night is a strange place to be whispering, and I was whispering anyway. How did you know that? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm not entirely sure how to explain what I do or how it works. I've been driving for about 3 years, and it happens sometimes. I'll have a passenger and something comes through. Not always, not even often, but sometimes. A detail about the person or about someone connected to them. I've learned not to ignore it when it does. I said, what do you mean, comes through? He said, I get an impression, like a word or an image that shows up in my head that isn't mine. I've been trying to understand it for 3 years, and the best I've gotten is that some people are carrying something, and sometimes what they're carrying makes itself visible to me, not the person themselves usually, more what they're holding. I thought about that. I was aware that this was in fact probably more likely to be, an elaborate cold reading, the kind of thing that people who are good at reading body language and social cues can perform with the appearance of genuine perception. He'd noted I was carrying grief, a reasonable observation. He'd guessed my dad, which was a reasonable next step. The teacher detail could have been a lucky guess or an elaboration I was unconsciously feeding through my reactions. But I had gone still when he said it, and he had said it, that specific, unusual, private detail, without any lead-in, without any prompting, without any fishing for information that I'd return to him. He'd said it flat, the way you say something you simply know. I said, what else do you get? He was quiet for a moment, looking at the road. Then he said, he's proud of you. I know that sounds like the thing you say to someone in this situation, and I'm sorry for that. I know it sounds like a line, but that's what comes through most strongly when I try to be specific about it. Pride. The particular kind that has patience in it, that's been watching you for a long time, the kind that isn't surprised by you, just pleased, consistently pleased. I looked out the window at the streets going by, my city at 9 on a Tuesday, quiet and lit and ordinary, and me in the back of a car that was carrying me home through it with tears running down my face. That I was making no effort to stop because there was no point and because they needed to go somewhere. And this seemed as good a place as any. I didn't say anything for a while, and he didn't either. And it was the most comfortable silence I have been in with a stranger. He drove, and I looked out the window, and the city went by, and the grief that had been sitting at the back of my mind all evening found the surface and moved through me the way it needed to, and I let it. When we were a few blocks from my place, I said, does this happen with everyone? He said no. He said maybe 1 in every 30 or 40 rides. Something came through. He said he used to wonder what the variable was, what made it happen with some people and not others. And he'd eventually concluded it had less to do with him than with the person, that some people were carrying something that wanted to be seen, that wanted to find its way somewhere, and occasionally he was the one it found its way through, something that wanted to find its way somewhere. I thought about my dad, who had wanted to be a teacher and hadn't been, who had watched me from a distance of pride that didn't need to announce itself, who had spent a long illness understanding that his time was coming and had done so with the quiet practicality that he had brought to everything hard in his life. I thought about whether there was anything he might have wanted to say, any piece of business he might have wanted to find its way somewhere. Just that. Consistent, patient, pleased. I think that was it. I think that was the whole message, if message is even the right word. Not an explanation or an apology or a reckoning or any of the things we sometimes think the dead would want to communicate if they could. Just the thing that had been true all along, the thing that didn't need to be said because it had always been visible, offered one more time through an accidental conduit on a Tuesday night because maybe that's what was available. He pulled up to my building. I got out and I thanked him for the ride and for the other thing, both, and he said you're welcome with the same ease he'd had through the whole conversation, as though carrying people's grief and serving as an occasional conduit for the things they were holding was simply part of the service, an extension of the job, no more remarkable than knowing the quickest route. I rated him 5 stars. I wrote in the note, thank you for the conversation. I don't know if he saw it. I don't know if he remembered me by then or whether I was just one of the 30 or 40 rides between the times when something came through. I think about him sometimes. I think about what it would be like to do that, to drive strangers through cities at night, and occasionally have something arrive in your head that belongs to them and their people, to carry that matter-of-factly alongside everything else the job required, the logistics of it, the emotional texture of it, the particular quality of Tuesday nights and back seats and cities going by outside the window. My dad wanted to be a teacher. He was good at explaining things, at making connections, at the patience that teaching required. He spent 30 years doing something else that he was also good at and that he didn't complain about, and he raised a kid, and he was consistently, patiently pleased by that kid, and eventually he died the way people do at the end of a long illness with enough time to make peace with it. A stranger in a dark sedan told me what I already knew. But sometimes you need to hear what you already know from someone who has no reason to say it. Sometimes that's the whole thing. Just someone saying the true thing plainly, without agenda, from the front seat of a car on an ordinary Tuesday night. Sleep well, whatever you're carrying tonight. I hope it's a little lighter by morning, and I hope whatever needed to find its way somewhere has found it. Good night.